And yesterday, there were 127 eviction hearings. So our panelists that are joining me today, who I'm about to introduce, are going to help us get a sense of the problem at scale from kind of a numbers perspective, and also understand really the intimacy of what goes on inside the courtroom. So with us, we have Farwah Raza, who's a staff attorney with Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, and Kat Alexander with Eviction Lab, and Julio Orduña, who works with us at Texas Housers and helps to lead our eviction solidarity network with regards to COVID. And so I wanted to start, Ian, Kat, with you as the kind of researcher with a kind of zoomed out view of things. First of all, for anyone that might not know, I would imagine that if you're on a call at 12:30 in the afternoon about evictions, you might have heard of Eviction Lab. But for those that are unfamiliar, could you explain what Eviction Lab is and how it's kind of interacting with the COVID-19 pandemic and how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed what Eviction Lab does?
Yeah. So first, thanks so much for inviting me to this call. This is a great roundup of experts, a great idea. So Eviction Lab is a research group at Princeton. We're within the Department of Sociology and have sociologists, economists, public housing folks. And our goal is to conduct academic research on eviction and residential rental instability in the United States. And so, that started with creating the eviction map, which is the largest database of eviction filings and eviction rates in the nation. And so, that brings together more than 80 million eviction records to look at a broad picture of how eviction is different in different communities. During COVID, we realized that our normal work looking at analyzing these records, which span from 2000 to 2016, wasn't going to give people what they needed in this moment of, enormous, unprecedented economic instability. And so my colleague, Peter Hepburn, had the idea, who's a professor at Rutgers, Newark, had the idea for the eviction tracking system, which reports out how many evictions are filed week by week in several, I think it's about 24 now, cities and five states, including 3 cities in Texas. And so, our work has changed to both looking at those longer term studies, but also helping, community members, reporters, and policy folks understand right now where the eviction crisis is taking off during COVID, what policies are working really well to keep people housed during the pandemic, where these policies are not really working as well. And so this kind of in the moment research, which is a lot more building the plane while flying it than our typical work, but we're very happy to do it, obviously.
Yeah, rapid response research is so important. And you said that you track filings and not case outcomes. Do you have a sense of how many filings translate into actual evictions?
Yeah, so the ETS only has the filings rather than case outcomes in all cases. On our regular eviction map, that 80 million records project, we have outcomes in most places. But it's not always possible in the moment to get that outcome information. And so while we know that there's a lot of heterogeneity among communities, whether, in some places where the filing rates are really, really high, like in Maryland, for instance, we know that not every eviction filing translates to an eviction. We know that in other places where the filing rate is lower, like in Alabama, those two numbers, the eviction filing rate and the eviction rate, might be really similar. So, it varies a lot place by place. And we also know that a certain number of people are going to leave their house even if the case doesn't end in a judgment for the plaintiff. So even if, the case is ultimately dismissed, they might still leave because they, expected that the case would not turn out in their favor and they wanted to get out now. So, you know, the question of how many people are actually being displaced right now is really difficult to answer, and we don't have great data for what that looks like on the ground, unfortunately.
Yeah, can you, just one last question for you for the start.
Mhm.
How does Texas stack up against other states in this moment with regards to filings and, kind of deep crisis?
Yeah, I mean, not great. There are definitely, you know, we've seen that throughout the pandemic, filings are much lower right now than we would expect. Like there were many fewer eviction filings in Texas in 2020 compared to in 2019, for instance. That said, you know, Texas certainly has many more eviction filings than places that have really strong moratoria, like Minneapolis, for instance, is still under a statewide eviction moratorium. And as a result, you know, people in Minneapolis are staying housed, whereas people in Houston may not be. There's also this heterogeneity in Texas because, you know, we've got 3 sites right now. We've got Houston, Fort Worth, and Austin on the eviction tracking system. And Austin is still under an eviction moratorium. And so we're seeing many, many fewer filings in Austin compared to in Houston or Fort Worth. Both, you know, in terms of raw numbers and in terms of like Austin is seeing a fraction of what we would expect, whereas Houston is seeing a much larger fraction of what we would expect in a regular February, for
Right.
instance.
And Farwah, you practice in Northwest Texas, right?
Yes.
So how have you and the organization you work for launched been serving clients facing eviction during the COVID-19 crisis?
So Legal Aid of Northwest Texas represents tenants in North and West Texas. It's 114 counties that we cover, and we've been doing evictions since before the pandemic. At the moment, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had to take we had to make some very important decisions, and we chose that for the safety of both our applicants as well as our staff, our offices or physical offices are for the most part closed to the public. I mean, they're still functional and working offices, but most of us are working remotely as a consequence of the pandemic. That comes with its own set of challenges, but we've really been in a very good position to make that transition pretty early on, and we've made ourselves accessible and available online through our LAL, which is you call and immediately you end up with an attorney on the phone, and you can put your applications in that way. So we've tried to make ourselves available as much as we can. You also have to understand that this is really, it's a fluid situation. So, needs are evolving. And so all of that, as the needs evolve, we're growing with the needs, we're changing our tech with the needs. But yeah, I mean, it's, at the moment it's remote, and then a lot of our hearings are remote. So that sort of makes a big difference. So yeah, I mean, that's really what's happened is we're seeing that technology has really become a very, very important factor when it comes to evictions now during the pandemic.
Do you have accessibility concerns with, conducting hearings in kind of Zoom court of law, as it were?
Yeah, and I think, we've been in this pandemic for quite a while now. So this is definitely now the new normal, right? So it's kind of hard to even recall what pre-pandemic normal looked like, because we've adjusted so much and we've had to make those adjustments. And so I think initially when we first had it, people were, Zoom was like, what is Zoom? Now it's almost become like this household name that a lot of folks are familiar with. And so it's accessibility, I think initially was more of a challenge, and it's slowly becoming less so because both as an agency, we're being proactive about addressing it. I think courts are making an effort to address it. I think, things that we used to take for granted, we no longer take for granted. For instance, like I will my phone available to my clients in a way that it wasn't available before. It's like, well, text me if things go wrong and we need to make this phone call immediately because things have changed. So accessibility, of course, it continues to remain an issue, for our clients, because you have to understand, for them, their phone is their computer, it is their printer, it is their everything, and so you have to kind of navigate around that. A lot of times it's like, well, take really, really good pictures and send them to me so I can upload and e-file them, and so that's how you also learn about new technology and new apps, for instance. You kind of get used to keeping up with that information as well. There's a new scanning app, and that allows you to take a picture and it makes it into a PDF for you. And so you kind of become acclimated with things that historically you just took for granted and really largely ignored. But yes, of course, for our clients, a lot of times I've had homeless clients who that they need Wi-Fi and free Wi-Fi, so accessibility is much more challenging for them, because there are certain days when they're going to be near a place where there's free Wi-Fi where they can make a phone call. I have a senior citizen client who just lost access to voicemail, and she couldn't check email or text messages to begin with. So the only way I can communicate with her is if I call her and she picks up, So there are these challenges, but like I said, we're doing the best we can to navigate around them.
Yeah. Julia, you've also spent a lot of time in courtrooms via Zoom as part of the Houston Eviction Solidarity Network. Do you want to explain for us what the Houston ESN is and kind of how you've been looking at court over the last couple of months?
Yeah, of course. So the Houston Eviction Solidarity Network started as a project when I started watching court with BASTA, which is Building and Strengthening Tenant Action in Travis County. And so when we moved into a pandemic, they started court watching virtually. And so I jumped in and started helping them observe what was happening. And like ANCAT said, they got a moratorium early on. And so it was no longer necessary to be watching court as heavily. And then we saw there was this big filing still happening in Harris County. And so we decided to stand up some type of court watching system to be able to mirror what BASTA was doing in Harris County. And to kind of answer those questions that ANCAT was saying, that we can't really see through the data that we have right now from the eviction filings, what is actually being translated into an actual eviction. So the point of court watching is to get that on the ground, in the moment, real time assessment of, our protections being used properly? Are the justice of the peace doing discovery and talking to each of the tenants and the landlords? Are the tenants using those protections, or do they know what their rights are? And so all of this kind of gives us a window as to what is happening currently in eviction court as we're moving through this pandemic.
Is it common that, you've watched hundreds of cases at this point? Have you seen a lot of representation for tenants? What kind of power imbalances are tenants experiencing? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so for representation, unfortunately, it's very slim to none when we've seen a tenant show up with legal representation. I personally have only seen 3 cases where there has been, actually 4, because one of them was pro se. He was representing himself. So it's difficult. And I actually talked to one of our volunteers, because we do have several volunteers watching with us and logging this information. I talked to one of our volunteers last week, and they said that they saw a case that the tenant was trying to dispute the illegality of the notice to vacate delivery, that they send it through a text message instead of the actual mode of which they should have been sending the notice to vacate. And so the justice of the peace was kind of pushing back with the tenant. And when the tenant said, I would like an attorney, the justice said, well, you should have made those arrangements before you showed up to your hearing, and then followed and ruled for the plaintiff. And that's where that case kind of ended. And it wasn't until the tenant asked, well, what is the process of appealing, that any of those details were divulged to the tenant. So I think that as far as imbalances, we're not hearing everything that's happening. I think that's one of those issues in the court, is just the consistency of the inconsistency of the justice of the pieces. Everybody kind of talks differently in their court. And so we've seen one justice, they asked two questions. Did the tenant pay rent this month? And did they deliver a CDC order? And if the answer is no to both of those questions, that is for the plaintiff, ruled for the plaintiff, and the judge tells the tenant when they should move out. And that's the whole case. That's the whole hearing. So there's no discovery. There's no really knowing how many months the landlords are asking for rent. And we have seen that the justice of the peace that actually ask for the monthly rent and the ones that ask for the total amount owed are catching those issues and saying, no, you're calculating rent incorrectly. It's actually much less. And if those things aren't said during the case, the tenant can't dispute those facts, and they may actually be awarding the landlord an illegal eviction. So those are some of the inconsistencies that we're seeing. I think there's also a big power imbalance between the way the justice of the peace approaches the plaintiffs and the way they approach the defendants, which are the tenants. We do see that the same property manager comes in constantly for the same apartment complex. There are multiple, these lawyers that are hired as eviction lawyers for the plaintiff, for the landlords, end up getting some type of repertoire with the justice of the peace. And so between hearings, you'll see, oh, I'll see you later today. And it's a very smooth conversation that they may have with these property managers and these landlords and the lawyers. But when we turn around with the tenants, the majority of the tenants, this is their first time ever in eviction court, the first time ever meeting this justice. And so that rapport has not been built up. And so you hear that in the way that the justice of the peace kind of either cut off the tenant or undermine the facts that they're bringing up. In where if a landlord says, I didn't get that payment, and the tenant says, I did pay, and the tenant doesn't show that proof, it is more possible for the JP to side with the landlord if that proof is not, if it's just hearsay. So I think those are some of the things that we're definitely dealing with and seeing in the courts.
One of the biggest protections that's currently on offer, I guess I could say, to tenants is the Eviction Diversion Program, which I know many housing advocates have issue with, because you have to actually be in the eviction pipeline and be already brought into the process by having a filing against you to kind of gain access to the aid through that program. And I was wondering, Orduña or Farwah, have you seen a lot of success for tenants with the Eviction Diversion Program?
Do you want me to, Julia, it's up to
Go
you.
ahead, yeah.
Okay.
You can both share.
So, just to kind of follow up a little bit, and I think it kind of needs a little bit of following up with who you said. These issues with, displacement of people, with eviction, the power balance have been in existence since before the pandemic. The pandemic has brought attention to them, and I'm very grateful for that. I've been practicing for about 12 years in this area, and I can tell you historically, this is very unprecedented. The attention, the political and the social and generally the attention tenants and tenants' rights are getting is unprecedented, and it's important that it's something that we talk about. In that sense, the diversion program, again, was a well-intended program, but I think much like a lot of other things, there's a little bit of disconnect from what's really happening on the grassroots level. Again, very well intended, unprecedented in the sense that it's now trying to, actually address displacement of people and prevent displacement of people. But really on a very, very, on the ground grassroots level, there are a lot of challenges, and one of the main challenges really is that it does require both parties to agree to the diversion program. So you have these landlords who are like, well, I've already put the money in, I've already done all the paperwork, I've already paid this eviction lawyer to be at this proceeding. What's my incentive to not follow through today? You also have, you also have part of the diversion program. The CDC declaration needs to be submitted by the tenant, because like who was saying, if it's a non-pay, there's no CDC declaration, we're not moving to the diversion program part really, practically. And so that puts the burden on the tenant to actually have submitted those forms, right? And a lot of these tenants, even though it's there in paper, even though, we're talking about it, are not actually submitting those documents. Some of these tenants aren't even showing up to the hearings. In fact, a lot of default hearings is what's common in most Texas courts. It's just very, very common. So all of that sort of affects the efficacy of this program, right, on the very ground level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll say that I think that one of the biggest problems with this is just the historic inability of the government to really stand up disaster recovery programs. This is not the first disaster that the United States has dealt with, and we don't learn from previous disasters how to build this apparatus correctly the next time. And I think Farwah hit it right on the nail. Like, in practical, on paper, it looks beautiful, but when you translate it into action and actual practice, things just don't pan out the same way. And so the TED program, or the TDEP, the Texas Eviction Diversion Program, we did have a pilot last year, and there was that requirement for the landlord to approve to be a part of this in order for the tenant to get aid. I know there are kind of things that are changing right now. I think that one of the confusion comes with, we had the TDEP, now we have the TRR, there's also the TEARAP. And so there's all these acronyms coming around that people are getting lost with, which one's the new program, which one's the old program, which one's no longer being used. And so where to really navigate all this. And I think some of that is just getting lost in between advocates and the court, as well as the tenants trying to really navigate all of this. I think language barrier is a big issue. I actually saw somebody in court say that they didn't know how to read or write, and they were having somebody help them file their taxes, and they ended up getting all their taxes stolen and couldn't get the CDC in order. And so these are just barriers people are dealing with in life. And so these programs really have to be not only stood up, but have some type of feedback loop, so we can go back and assess them truly, wholeheartedly, and see what we really have to do to make the most impact, to really help people who are getting through these issues.
Which
Yeah,
just kind of add to that, I was just going to say, just to add to that, yes, and in that spirit, there has been some evolution, right? So I think there was a lesson learned, and so now if you go to the Texas Rent Relief Program, there is an opportunity for tenants to make that application without the landlord. So it is a program that's evolving, but then we're coming up on the March 31st deadline. So by the time that, like just what Joy is saying with disaster, it's very reactive, it's not proactive. And so in that sense, yeah, there was a policy change in reaction to what was happening on the ground level, but now we're up against this 31st deadline, pretty much a few weeks from when this program rolled out. So, it's just, yeah. So I think that the fact that we're reacting constantly, as opposed to being proactive, also sort of affects the positive results we want to see at the conclusion of these programs.
Yeah, so we've talked mostly about the state level program. I wanted to take a moment and talk about the CDC order. And I don't like to call it a moratorium for various reasons, but have you seen that be in any way successful in helping stabilize your clients, Farwah or Julia, in your court watching?
So again, I'll loop back to, you know, most of these moratoriums have been very helpful because there has been, like Julie was saying before, there's been an incredible power imbalance in the courtrooms. And so historically, when you have a non-pay, there was very limited defenses when it came to a non-pay. And so this has changed that. This has changed that conversation. All of those attorneys for property managers that are used to evictions going very quickly, being able to sort of do several evictions in a short period of time. This has really changed that dynamic a little bit, all of these moratoriums. Again, there are issues, practical issues with the CDC declaration in that one of them being that it really puts the burden on the tenant to submit it. The other one is that it allows for a challenge, and the challenge leaves great room for the justice of peace to kind of, assess it however they want to. So that discretion leads to very, very different results in different justice of peace courts. So, and it really is consistent with that justice of peace's social position. And so, if you have a justice of peace that's typically leaned towards property managers, that challenge enables them to continue to do that. And it really does make a difference when, you have an advocate. Again, there isn't enough legal aid attorneys out there, but
in the world, yeah.
Yeah, I think we could always use more, but when we are there, it does change the dynamic. So you can give somebody a CDC declaration, they can go in and they will get evicted. And I've seen that. I'm like, but did you submit the CDC? Because they'll come to us post eviction.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, yes, we did. And they'll lose at that challenge hearing because they don't know how to articulate a proper defense. And so part of it is, yes, that CDC declaration, but it practically almost is CDC declaration plus attorney equals to really for it to be effective. But on its own, it's really not doing, I think, what again, very good intentions were.
And Julia, in Harris County, where the Houston Eviction Solidarity Network is active, there are 16 justices of the peace. Can you talk a little bit about, Farwah alluded to it, the different worldviews of the justices of the peace and the different kind of ways that plays out on the bench that you've seen?
Yeah, so there are 16 JPs. Unfortunately, not all of them are currently streaming. And those are the more heavy docket caseload justices. They just are not allowing that accessibility. And so those with the higher eviction cases are the ones we haven't been able to watch. There are the other justices that are making their cases accessible. And so when we do start watching them, like Farwah said, like, yes, the CDC protection helps. At the same time, it doesn't. If the justice talks about it, it can help. We do see lots of tenants come in and they don't know about it. There is that requirement to put it with the paperwork, but not a lot of them read it. It is a very heavy document as well. If you're overwhelmed with the legal jargon, it may just be hard for you to understand. And like Farwah said, if you have that legal representation that can kind of lead you through it, you are more successful in using it. And I will say that the CDC declaration can also be given to stop a writ of possession. So even if the person has gone through the eviction hearing and they still give that CDC declaration, it'll still pause what could possibly happen and give them some time. And people don't know that. Some justice of the peace are at a point of what I'm calling protection fatigue. We've even seen one justice that says, I'm not in the business of questions. So I'm not here to answer anything. I don't want to know what you need to know. If you need to know that, you need to figure that out on your own, or look at the bulletin boards, or go find it on yourself. And so it's really hard to see that pan out. And then there's other justices that I have seen that do the discovery. And within the CDC order, it actually says that the justice of the peace can ask questions to see if this person is a covered person. And so I did see a justice say, okay, well, what happened with your job loss? When did you start working? When did you stop working? To really assess if this person qualifies for that CDC declaration. And so I have heard that they say, you know, it sounds like you might be covered person. Please look at this, submit it if you can. And so they give them a little more, not to say advice, because it's not advice, it's just really the facts of what the protections are out there, and tell them, well, this is available to you right now. Look at it and submit it to the court, versus just kind of cutting them off and telling them that, well, this is when you've got to move out. And so you see that kind of play out. I think with the CDC declaration, we were observing the courts in December, and from what we saw in December, out of 224 cases, I believe, only 30 people submitted a CDC declaration. So that's just that they're not submitting it. If this protection is not submitted, if they don't actively do anything, it doesn't protect them. And one of the things that we're also kind of thinking about is that the CDC order was written for implicitly non-payment of rent. There are some people that are saying that this may affect other cases as well. And some judges are saying, no, this is explicitly only non-payment of rent cases. And so now that we're what I'm calling the anniversary, is the anniversary of the virus in the United States, we're here in March. And so not only are we getting to this 1 year, leases are coming up. I've had to renew my lease, and I was able to. Some people may not be able to renew their lease. And so if these they were non-payment of rent cases, are becoming holdover cases, is there going to be some type of protection for these people that are now multiple months in debt, no longer have a written lease to protect them, and the CDC moratorium no longer allows them to use this protection? So is there going to be some type of change to this protection, or is there going to be a new protection that comes out? And I wonder how the administration that has taken over this pandemic is going to react to everything that we're seeing on the ground.
Right. You know, we're like 20 days out from the expiration of the CDC order. It would be nice to know before, like before the 31st, if it's going to get extended and how. I think it's super important. We heard you talk about how kind of the best protections are automatic protections. They're ones that, really blanket and cover people that are in most severe need and risk for houselessness. And Farwah, you mentioned that attorney plus CDC is kind of the magic combination. And Kat, I was wondering what other protections have worked across the nation, and what other programs are you seeing that are particularly powerful for people?
Yeah, so we recently put out a preliminary analysis of ETS data looking at which moratoria are most effective at preventing eviction filings and keeping people housed. And we put particular emphasis on the eviction filing because we know from other research that as soon as a tenant has been filed against, even if they ultimately are able to stay in their home, it'll make it much harder for them to find secure, decent housing down the line. So we really want to be preventing, as well as the fact that some tenants will move out after getting that filing, even if the judge doesn't order that to happen. And so we really emphasize that preventing filings is absolutely key. And so when we dove into the cities on the ETS to look at what local protections and state level protections are most effective at preventing filings, we did find that yes, the most effective measures are those that stop the eviction process really early, ideally preventing landlords from even sending a notice to quit, not even just the filing. Like, we want that notice to not be sent. And also the ones that limit filings the most are going to be the ones that don't require the tenant to take any action or to prove anything. So like if tenants have to prove that they have lost income, which was the case in some states, or if tenants have to take a specific action, like providing the CDC declaration to their landlord. Those two things are going to result in tenants that the policymaker wanted to be covered. They wanted that person not to be evicted, but the tenant is evicted anyway because they lack the resources to demonstrate that they should be covered or to take the actions that they need to take in order to be covered. And so those, when those narrow policies are put into place, they're going to be less effective at preventing evictions, preventing filings, preventing displacement.
Yeah, it's a perverse kind of a means testing almost.
Exactly.
I was wondering, since you have this kind of global view of with the ETS, and this is totally a personal bias question, but why is Houston so bad? What is missing in Houston?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're still looking into is we're like, the CDC moratorium or order, I definitely understand the rationale for not calling it a moratorium since it requires tenant action, and only covers some tenants. We're like, this order applies everywhere in the whole country as long as there are COVID cases and there isn't a stronger local protection already in place. So like this federal order doesn't preempt a stronger protection somewhere else. And so with that in mind, how is it the case that in Tampa, Florida, eviction filings are at like 90% of a normal caseload, whereas in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which doesn't have any other moratorium in place, they're down below right around 30%. Like why are these orders not being equally effective across the country? And it does seem to have something to do with the way that the order is being implemented at the court level. So, it could be that, in Houston, the reason that the rate is there are about half as many eviction filings as normal in Houston right now. And that really high rate could be the result that of not offering as many rent relief programs that are really easy for tenants to apply for. That could be the result of like problems in tenant education, the state not investing in making sure that like tenants know about the moratorium. We're still looking into exactly what is driving these differences because it's clearly, not just a huge problem for all of the thousands of people across the country who are being evicted. It's a huge problem for them, but it's also, this is a failure in the implementation of this policy, that there's so much difference between how it's being implemented in different places. So like, we want to understand exactly what caused this failure to have a consistent federal policy.
Absolutely. I was wondering, are there, Farwah, you mentioned like seeing certain personalities in court time and again, like a certain property manager or something like that. And Kat, do you see the same certain types of landlords or properties repeating in your data?
Yeah, this is something that we're really interested in because, the main thing for the eviction lab is looking at, how can we have fewer people displaced? And one of the means of approach for that might be approaching some landlords differently than others. And so, we are still conducting our research to see like how different landlord types interact with eviction court differently. There's been some research out of Atlanta indicating that at least in that jurisdiction, corporate landlords are likelier to file and likelier to serially file. So, filing in May, June, and July because the tenant paid on the 15th of the month each month instead of on the 1st because they got paid twice and couldn't make rent until after that second paycheck. Mm-hmm. But we're still looking into seeing, what differences in landlord behavior and landlord type translate into different outcomes in eviction court, because it definitely would rationally make sense to see, maybe mom and pop landlords are likelier to try to work something out with a tenant, whereas corporate tenants or corporate landlords just file immediately. But that's something we're still looking at studying.
Yeah, I think the idea of delineating between the different types of landlords is really important, and for a variety of reasons. One, I think culturally we have this tendency to overemphasize the presence of mom and pop, like low to moderate income landlords, when we know, the vast acquisition of housing by corporate landlords and at varying levels of, sophistication after the last crisis. So I think it's very important to design for each of those, for tenants in each of those kind of scenarios, right?
Yeah, like a lot of the breathing space in this debate is taken up about like, oh, well, what about, the mom and pop landlord who owns only 6 units, and like if one tenant falls behind, like that's really bad for their bottom line. And it's like, well, you don't even know that is like the most common landlord in your area. So like, why are we putting so much weight on that person? And why are we, instead of thinking about it as, well, how can we make sure that that person is getting the help that they need through perhaps a landlord small business grant? Why are we instead thinking of it as, this is a reason why we shouldn't have tenant protections?
Right. So there are a couple of questions that have come in through the chat to me directly, and then I think more generally. But I wanted to ask Julia and Farwah, before we can turn to those questions, is there a case or something that really stands out for you, like a proceeding that you've watched in the last 12 months now, that you think you're going to kind of carry with you?
You know what? I will say that watching court is deja vu. I feel like all of the cases eventually kind of meld together. It's the same things that happen over and over again. And you kind of forget who was who because they all kind of happened in the same way. But one of the cases, or one of the ones that really kind of plays over and over in my memory, is there were the plaintiff and defendant both in person, both white males standing in front of the judge, and the defendant, the tenant, submitted a CDC declaration, and the judge asked the landlord 3 times if he wanted to participate in the TED program. And every time the question was asked, the landlord just said, I just want him out of his house. And so the JP would reiterate, well, you can't kick him out right now. You can take the money right now. And even went as far as saying you can participate in the program right now and still continue the eviction once the CDC declaration has been lifted. And so that kind of conversation where the JP is so willing to pressure the landlord into taking anything that assists them, but is so standoffish with the tenants. And like I said, she's the JP that says, I'm not in the business of questions. So if the tenant asks anything, I'm not liable to answer anything. But if the landlord's asking, or if the landlord just doesn't want to get anything out of it, she was very persistent. And so that just felt kind of strange for me. And so it's one of the things that I battle with internally as to how do we speak up against these justice of the peace, or educate them in the sense that, hey, maybe this isn't the way that you should be treating people in your court or running your court. So yeah, that's one of the ones that pops in constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think one of the important things to sort of realize for folks, that are looking at this from the outside is that a lot of these folks are here not because it wasn't something they chose to do. You have folks that, genuinely have never faced an eviction before, had jobs, want to continue to have jobs, want an income coming in. And so they were just put in this situation and had nothing to do with anything that they did. And I think one of my cases really highlights it. I had this lady who, very early on in the pandemic ended up, getting COVID. She was hospitalized. And she, survived and came out, and then ended up, losing her job. And so now she had no economic, income coming in. And she, even when she came back home from the hospital, she was significantly impaired just because this disease kind of took that kind of toll on her health. And so, she used up her savings as much as she could, because this was really early on in the pandemic, and was able to pretty much, live through her savings. Towards the end of the year is when she ended up getting served with eviction papers and came to us. And, there's been so many different moratoriums. We kind of guided her through it. And then when at the end of the year, we were in kind of the same position we're in right now. We don't know, what's going to happen on the 31st. And so December 31st was about to roll around, and she's like, I'm trying my very best. I'm trying to borrow. I really don't know what's going to happen, but I'm also feeling very, very ill, and I need to go back into the hospital. And I just don't want to come out of the hospital to find that my stuff has been put out on the street and I've lost it. Because that's essentially what happens. When an eviction happens, at some point, the constable comes over and puts stuff out on the street, and people just take it. And if you're in the hospital, you're not going to have the opportunity to put it in storage. So just to sort of, this is really just outside looking in. These are the things that people are having to deal with. This is what they're having to make very, very hard decisions about. I had a client who was on the phone with me, and we're in people's personal spaces. We're in their homes, they're in our homes. You can hear things in the background. So this was after Hurricane Uri, and she was really struggling with having water and food, because the fridge wasn't working. And you could hear the kids in the back going, "Mom, I want to eat food. Can we go get burgers?" And you're hearing these things. It's hard. But she said go get pizza, but I knew what it was about. It was about her staff benefits, right? So, yeah. And she was trying to redirect it, and you're hearing it. You're in people's homes, so it's hard.
Yeah, no, the kids are always the hardest part. Kat, I want to make sure that this is from someone. Well, okay, there are now two questions. Does the government tend to put resources towards tracking and studying eviction, or is it all on a state? Does the federal government put these resources, or is it on a state and local level? What's the kind of governmental input to support research like yours, or does government conduct this on its own, do you think?
Yeah, so the federal government does not track evictions. And states can sometimes tell you how many cases were filed, although not always much more than that. When the eviction lab first started, we kind of went around and, asked states and asked counties, can you give us eviction data? And some would say just, "Oh, we don't have that." And you'd say, "Oh, so you don't know how many people are being legally put out of their homes in your state every year?" And the answer was no. And so, that is changing some. There are, more state court systems are moving to digital, so they, have some built-in administrative data, and there are some more local level efforts. But no, we get questions from state and federal government officials asking us about really basic level eviction data that it boggles the mind sometimes that they are coming to a sort of, not to diminish our work, but a ragtag team of sociologists at Princeton. To a certain extent, it does end up being why are y'all coming to us and we're not going to you? And so, I saw the question in the chat ends with, what impact does this have on research and advocacy? And, I wonder about if we had eviction statistics at the federal level, the way that we have like highway accident statistics, then maybe there would be changes to eviction court the same way that like cars are now required to have seat belts. But the fact is that right now it's a really informal effort, largely done by, you know, researchers like us and other groups around the country that are shining a light on this issue that governments have chosen to largely ignore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, the policy that we create and the research that we conduct reflects our priorities. And right now what we're seeing is that renters have become a priority only because of deep social crisis, even though they were in crisis, you know, as Farwah said earlier, long before this happened. So I want to be mindful of time, and I don't want to cram too much into the remaining 6 minutes of our time together. We did have someone ask, how can I get involved? So I'm gonna punt that to Julia in a second, but I'll first say that I don't know who wrote this question or where they're staying, where they live, but I strongly encourage them to look up the eviction data in their own city, right? If they're lucky enough to be on the ETS tracking system, that would
Got
be
1 in
amazing.
5 renters now, approximately.
Yep. And so we want to make sure that that people really have this discourse and this understanding of the situation in their own backyard. And if they want to do court watch, Julia, how might they do court watch?
Yeah, so the Houston Eviction Solidarity Network is online. We do watch court in Harris County, so you can go to houstonevictionsolidarity.org and sign up for a training. And so we'll train you as to what court watch looks like, sounds like, and how to log this so we can continue collecting all this information. I will also say that we have been helping other places stand up court watch. They are trying to be virtual and it may not be accessible, but they're still trying to figure that out. So there may be something coming soon in your area. If you want to join with us and are interested in seeing what's happening in those areas, we can of course send you to the appropriate person. I know there's something happening in San Antonio. Of course, Basta is continuing their longstanding pre-pandemic court watch program in Travis, even though, like Ann-Kat said, there is a moratorium, a grace period right now there that is holding up some protections. Dallas County is trying to figure something out, but eviction data has been very limited in Dallas. So that's been a little harder to really stand up. And Ellis County is another smaller county that really wants to see what's happening in their space. So that's all kind of coming around. And if you're willing to participate and want to stand in solidarity with the tenants, just contact us.
Yeah, and I put the link to the Houston Eviction Solidarity network in the chat for those that are on Zoom. The last question here is about the most recent congressional relief bill, which has a lot of money in it that's pegged for rental relief, and the person asking the question wanted to know where and how that money flows, and kind of the moonshot here is like, what would you like passed? Just to acknowledge that question, the money will flow from governments to either states or municipalities, depending on the size of the municipality. So, you know, it's quite possible that Houston, Harris County get their own allotments and other large metropolitan areas and run their own programs, whereas smaller counties will be the recipients of programs that are created and run at the state level, probably through TDHCA and things like that. With 3 minutes left, other than knowing that the CDC order is going to be extended or not extended before the 31st, what do you think is ahead for each of your work in court watch, in tenant representation, in research? And Farwah, you're off mute, so you can go first if you.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Oh, no problem. What is next? Whether or not the CDC order gets passed, what's next for your work and for your clients?
I mean, I think it's going to really, you know, it's always been sort of an uphill battle when you're talking about tenant advocacy. So I think that's going to continue to be the case. Also, I mean, we really have to think about, things holistically for our clients. I mean, there is just the need is beyond housing, but certainly that's a big component of it. But we need to kind of come up with plans in which we're thinking about, okay, well, where is the best place for you to be? What's, there is going to be a money judgment. Is that something that's going to affect you down the road? What does that mean in terms of consumer debt issues down the road? So, we have to think about things in a more holistic way. And that's going to be what we're going to continue to do. We also have to think about things strategically. So we're not kind of reinventing the wheel. We're kind of, we have a process and a plan for what to do come March 31st. And so we're thinking about that already, and what the responses are going to be. And then again, keeping an eye on what the next regulation is going to look like.
Yeah. And Kat?
Yeah, so we have a lot more research planned looking at what worked and what didn't work from the crisis, what is working and what isn't working as this continues. It's really exciting now that we're able to capture these data and this information in real time. We're expanding the ETS, hopefully. We've got some more sites planned. We've got research coming down about that. We also have more research coming out all the time that looks at our larger national data set, including our most recent peer-reviewed study was one from a dual PhD MD student, Gracie Himmelstein, about birth outcomes and how eviction affects a child if the eviction happens while the mother is pregnant. It's not good, as you would expect. And we've for a minute now been working on a major update to the eviction map to include more data, better coverage, so that we can look even more communities to see how many evictions are being filed. That update is coming in the future. People email us about it all the time. I promise it's coming. So we'll be keeping on whether or not the CDC moratorium expires, which sure everyone on this call very much hopes that protection does not end at the end of March.
And Julia, we work at the same organization, so I know what you're doing going forward, but if you wouldn't mind sharing for the folks on the call.
Yeah, so of course, we will continue watching court. We have very motivated volunteers that are really taking a proactive view into court watching. And so they really have ideas as to what needs to change, how things can change in the court, in protections. And so we're looking at how to consolidate all this information that these volunteer advocates are really seeing through a different lens, and how do we assess this into more actionable work, either towards the justice of the peace, towards the policy writers and people that are creating these protections. I think I will just say one of the things that we've noticed is people make payments and those payments go to late fees. And so the rent continues to accumulate even though people are still paying. And so how do we change that in a way that the tenant is actually progressing forward even though they're trying? And so we will continue to watch and continue to make our connections in the work, and hope to support everybody in the work that they're doing, whether with the legal aids or the research. This is all part of it. And so we're one web of eviction solidarity.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I know I'm 2 minutes over. Thank you for everyone that joined us. Thank you to all of our lovely panelists. Thank you for your work. It's a difficult thing to do every day, to wake up and study and sift through and advocate for, but is a amazing, tremendous cultural moment. And hopefully we can get a nice cultural shift out of this and have tenant rights fully respected. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.